The dogs came first. Always the dogs. Sheriff Tom Bradley found the bones scattered across 12 acres of red Georgia clay on November 15, 1972. Femurs gnawed clean, rib cages cracked open like wishbones, a human skull wedged between the roots of a dogwood tree, its surface scored by canine teeth, marks deep as pencil grooves. 23 German shepherds roamed the Mercer property outside Valdosta, fed twice daily from metal troughs that rang like church bells when the family patriarch, Ezra Mercer, struck them with a wooden ladle. The sound carried for miles across the Pine Barrens, calling his pack to feast. But Sheriff Bradley wasn't looking at dog food when he kicked through those bone piles. He was looking at wedding rings, belt buckles, a corroded Timex watch still ticking around a wrist bone clean as driftwood. The Mercers had been offering rides to hitchhikers for over a decade, taking them home for supper, making them part of the family, permanently. Highway 41 stretched through South Georgia like a scar across red earth, connecting the backwoods to the cities where young people went to disappear anyway. In 1961, before the interstate system carved new paths through the pine forests, that two-lane blacktop carried dreamers and drifters between Valdosta and Macon. Hitchhikers stood at every crossroads with their thumbs raised toward promises they'd never keep. The Mercer family understood opportunity when it walked up to their front door. Ezra Mercer owned 400 acres of scrubland 7 miles west of Valdosta, inherited from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Mercers had scratched a living from soil too sandy for crops and too swampy for cattle. But Ezra possessed a different kind of vision. He saw possibility in the parade of young faces walking past his property line every week. The Mercer compound sat a quarter-mile back from the highway, connected by a dirt road that wound through stands of longleaf pine and palmetto scrub. The main house was a rambling structure of unpainted cypress boards and corrugated tin roofing that had started as a shotgun shack in 1895 and grown like a tumor over the decades. Room after room added without plan or permit. 7 bedrooms, 3 kitchens. A root cellar that extended 30 feet underground. Ezra lived there with his wife Beulah, their 4 sons, Marcus, Joel, Silas, and Benjamin, and a rotating collection of cousins and in-laws who drifted in and out depending on their luck with the law. The family tree was more tangle than trunk, branches grafting onto other branches until bloodlines became suggestions rather than rules. But the dogs were pure German shepherd, 23 of them by 1961, bred for size and hunger rather than temperament. They roamed the property in packs, following invisible hierarchies that Ezra reinforced with rewards and punishment. He fed them twice daily from metal troughs, arranged in a semicircle behind the main house. The sound of his wooden ladle striking those troughs carried across the Pine Barrens like a dinner bell nobody wanted to answer. What the dogs ate varied by season and opportunity. The family business began by accident in the spring of 1961. A young man named David Forrester was walking north on Highway 41, carrying a canvas duffel bag and wearing his Army discharge papers in his shirt pocket. He'd finished his service at Fort Benning and was heading home to Tennessee when the afternoon heat got the better of him. Marcus Mercer, Ezra's eldest son, found him sitting in the shade beside the family's mailbox, dizzy and dehydrated. "You look like you could use some water," Marcus said from the cab of his pickup truck. David accepted the ride gratefully. The Mercers seemed like good people. Beulah cooked him a plate of fried chicken and green beans. Ezra shared a bottle of corn whiskey and stories about his own service in the Pacific. The family insisted David stay the night rather than walk the dark highway. He never left the property, David Forrester disappeared from the world without ceremony. His discharge papers went into Ezra's lockbox along with $43 in cash and a silver star earned on some forgotten beach in the Philippines. His duffel bag was burned in the family's trash pile. His body fed the dogs for 3 days. Nobody came looking. David had told his family he might spend a few weeks traveling before coming home. When he didn't arrive by summer's end, they assumed he'd found work somewhere or gotten into trouble. Ex-soldiers were drifting all over the country in 1961, chasing jobs and running from memories. One more missing veteran was just another casualty of peace. The Mercers learned important lessons from David Forrester's visit. Hitchhikers carried cash. They traveled alone. They told people they were going places without specifying when they'd arrive. Perfect guests for a family that had always struggled to make ends meet. Ezra began monitoring Highway 41 with new interest. He taught his sons to recognize opportunity when it walked past their property line. Young men carrying everything they owned in a backpack or duffel bag. College students heading to Florida for spring break. Migrant workers following crop seasons between Georgia and the Carolinas. Runaway teenagers escaping bad homes for worse destinations. The family developed a system. Marcus or Joel would drive the highway twice daily, scouting for suitable candidates. They looked for travelers who appeared tired, hungry, or desperate. People who would accept kindness from strangers without question. People who wouldn't be missed immediately. When they spotted someone promising, one of the brothers would pull over and offer a ride. Not to wherever the hitchhiker was going, but to the Mercer place for a meal and a place to rest. The family's reputation for hospitality began spreading among the transient population that moved through South Georgia. Word traveled the informal networks that connected flophouses and truck stops and hobo camps. The Mercers were good people who helped travelers in need. The second guest arrived in June 1961. A college student named Patricia Wells who was driving from Gainesville to Atlanta when her car broke down outside Valdosta. Marcus found her standing beside her stalled Volkswagen Beetle, crying into a payphone. He offered to tow her car to his family's property where his brother Joel could look at the engine. Patricia stayed for dinner while Joel diagnosed a blown head gasket that would cost more to fix than the car was worth. Beulah insisted she spend the night rather than hitchhike to Atlanta with just the clothes on her back. The family would drive her to the bus station in the morning. She never saw morning. Patricia's car was pushed into a sinkhole on the back of the property. Her body joined David Forrester's bones in the root cellar until Ezra decided the dogs needed variety in their diet. Her parents filed a missing person report that led nowhere. College students disappeared all the time in 1961, dropping out to join communes or protest movements, or simply escape the expectations that were crushing their generation. By autumn, the Mercers had perfected their routine. Identify suitable guests, provide overwhelming hospitality, wait for nightfall, handle the logistics, feed the dogs. The bones accumulated faster than they decomposed. Georgia's clay soil and humid climate preserved organic matter longer than Ezra expected, creating a storage problem he hadn't anticipated. The root cellar filled quickly. The family began digging secondary burial sites throughout their property, marking each location with wooden stakes that gradually rotted and disappeared. But the dogs remained the most efficient disposal method. German shepherds could consume an adult human in 72 hours if properly motivated. Ezra learned to supplement their regular diet with the evidence of the family's hospitality. What the dogs couldn't digest went into burn piles mixed with household trash and construction debris. Teeth and bone fragments scattered across 400 acres like seeds that would never grow. The operation expanded as word spread through the networks that connected America's dispossessed. The Mercer place became a known stop on informal maps passed between drifters and runaways, a safe place to rest between destinations, a family that fed travelers without asking questions or demanding payment, which was true in its way. The family's reputation reached ears that mattered. Truckers mentioned the generous folks outside Valdosta who would feed anyone who showed up hungry. Gas station attendants directed stranded motorists toward the Mercer property when other options failed. Even some local law enforcement began using the family as an unofficial resource for dealing with transients they didn't want cluttering their jurisdiction. "You send them out to the Mercers," Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison told his partner in 1963. "They'll get fed and moved along without causing trouble in town." Morrison had no idea what happened to the people he redirected toward the Mercer property. He saw the problem solved and asked no further questions. Police departments across South Georgia adopted similar policies. The Mercers became an unofficial social service for handling human problems that had no official solutions. The family processed an average of one guest per month through 1962 and 1963. Seasonal patterns emerged. More hitchhikers in spring when young people left home seeking adventure. Fewer in winter when smart travelers avoided the rural South. Summer brought college students and vacation travelers. Fall carried migrant workers following harvest seasons. Ezra maintained meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger he kept locked in his bedroom dresser. Names when possible, dates of arrival, physical descriptions, personal possessions of value, disposal methods and locations. He treated the information like business records because that's what they were. June 7, 1963. Michael Santos, age 22, heading to Florida. Carried $160 cash. Gold high school class ring. Buried northeast corner of property near the creek. August 15, 1963. Jennifer Morrison, age 19, traveling to New Orleans. $37 in purse. Silver charm bracelet. Fed to dogs over 3 days. October 3, 1963. Robert Chen, age 25, driving to Atlanta for work. $89 plus traveler's checks. Honda motorcycle sold in Macon for parts. The dogs grew fat and content. Their coats gleamed with health. Visitors to the property often commented on how well-fed and calm the animals appeared. Ezra accepted the compliments modestly, explaining that proper nutrition was the secret to raising quality livestock. He wasn't lying. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred carelessness. By 1964, the Mercer family's operation had grown beyond their property lines into a network of informal partnerships with people who had their own reasons for making problems disappear. Luther Vance owned a truck stop 12 miles east of Valdosta, where Interstate 75 would eventually connect Atlanta to Florida. In 1964, his business served the stream of traffic moving along Highway 41 between Georgia's interior and its coastal plains. Truckers, traveling salesmen, families driving to Disney World before Disney World existed, people with money and predictable schedules. Luther also served as an unofficial employment agency for temporary workers who needed cash and asked no questions. Men fleeing creditors or ex-wives, teenagers running from homes where they weren't wanted, women escaping situations that had no legal remedies in 1964 Georgia. When Luther encountered travelers who seemed particularly vulnerable or carried visible wealth, he developed a habit of recommending the Mercer place as a safe stop for the night. "Good Christian folks," he'd say. "They'll feed you proper and not charge a dime. Just head west on 41 about 7 miles and look for their mailbox." Luther received a finder's fee for each referral, usually cash, sometimes goods salvaged from grateful guests. The arrangement benefited both parties while maintaining plausible deniability. Luther could honestly say he was helping stranded travelers find shelter. The Mercers gained access to pre-screened candidates who arrived with recommendations from a trusted source. Dr. Raymond Kowalski ran the county medical examiner's office from a basement room in Valdosta General Hospital. He was 73 years old in 1964, a Polish immigrant who'd practiced medicine in rural Georgia since the 1920s. He'd seen everything the region could produce in terms of violent death and learned to ask only the questions that led to simple answers. When hunters or hikers occasionally discovered bone fragments on remote properties throughout the county, Dr. Kowalski performed cursory examinations that usually concluded the remains belonged to animals or were too degraded for positive identification. He filed reports that satisfied legal requirements without generating follow-up investigations. Georgia's backwoods were full of unmarked graves from 100 years of violence and neglect. A few more skeletons scattered through the pine forests raised no official concern. Dr. Kowalski never explicitly conspired with the Mercers, but his willingness to avoid difficult questions served their interests perfectly. He was a practical man who understood that some problems solved themselves if you left them alone. Judge Harrison Fleming presided over the county court system with an emphasis on efficiency over investigation. He'd built his career on moving cases through the system quickly, clearing dockets rather than pursuing complex prosecutions that might drag on for months. When occasional missing person reports crossed his desk, he routinely filed them in the category of unsolved but not urgent. People disappear for their own reasons, Judge Fleming would say. Our job is keeping track of the ones who stay. His philosophy reflected practical politics in 1960s Georgia. Missing persons investigations cost money and produced few convictions. Better to focus resources on crimes that generated clear evidence and satisfied public demands for justice. A hippie who vanished between Atlanta and Miami raised different concerns than a prominent local citizen who disappeared from his own driveway. The network operated through shared understanding rather than explicit coordination. Each participant played their role while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct responsibility. Luther Vance helped stranded travelers. Dr. Kowalski avoided jumping to conclusions about suspicious evidence. Judge Fleming processed cases efficiently. The Mercers provided hospitality to people who needed it. That nobody asked what happened after the hospitality ended was simply good manners. Not every guest disappeared immediately. Some earned temporary reprieve through usefulness or entertainment value. The Mercers weren't monsters, exactly. They were business people who understood that some assets appreciate over time, while others were consumed on arrival. Tommy Brewster arrived in March 1965 with a gift the family had never encountered before. He could fix anything mechanical that was broken and improve anything that already worked. Marcus found him walking north on Highway 41, carrying a canvas tool bag and wearing coveralls stained with honest grease. Tommy had worked as a mechanic in Jacksonville until a disagreement with his supervisor about union organizing led to his sudden departure from Florida. The Mercers brought Tommy home for their usual hospitality, but Ezra recognized immediately that killing him would waste a valuable resource. The family's vehicles were constantly breaking down. Their farm equipment was held together with wire and prayer. Tommy represented the solution to mechanical problems that had plagued the operation since its beginning. So Tommy lived. He slept in a converted tool shed behind the main house and worked 12 hours daily maintaining the family's increasingly complex logistics. He repaired the trucks that scouted Highway 41 for candidates. He built a more efficient cremation system for disposing of evidence. He modified the dog feeding troughs to hold larger quantities without spilling. Tommy understood his situation perfectly. He was a prisoner whose sentence was commuted to life as long as he remained useful. He never attempted escape because he knew the geography better than anyone. 400 acres of swampland surrounded by pine forests with no towns within walking distance. The dogs knew his scent and would track him within hours. His best chance of survival was making himself indispensable. He succeeded for 18 months. Sarah Caldwell lasted even longer. She arrived in September 1965 as a 19-year-old college dropout fleeing her parents' expectations and a boyfriend who'd grown too possessive. Sarah had been studying elementary education at Georgia Southern before deciding that teaching children wasn't her calling. She was hitchhiking to California when Joel Mercer found her at a roadside diner, counting coins to see if she could afford coffee and a sandwich. The family brought Sarah home with their usual intentions, but Beulah discovered that the girl had genuine domestic skills that complemented her own aging abilities. Sarah could cook elaborate meals for large groups. She understood how to preserve meat and vegetables for winter storage. She could sew and mend clothing with professional quality. Most importantly, she could manage the complex household logistics that kept 8 adults and 23 dogs fed and organized. Sarah also understood her situation. She was a prisoner whose life depended on making herself irreplaceable to people who killed for convenience. She threw herself into domestic work with desperate efficiency, learning every aspect of the family's operation while carefully avoiding knowledge that might force them to silence her permanently. She lasted 2 years before making the mistake that ended her usefulness. In December 1967, Sarah was discovered teaching Benjamin Mercer to read using magazines and newspapers she'd collected from guests' possessions. Ezra considered education a threat to family security. People who could read asked questions about things they saw in print. They developed ideas about life beyond the property boundaries. They became ambitious in ways that endangered everyone. Tommy Brewster lasted until April 1966. His mechanical skills had made the family's operation more efficient than ever, but efficiency bred overconfidence. Tommy had spent months modifying vehicles to transport guests without attracting attention. He'd built hidden compartments and soundproofing systems that allowed the family to work during daylight hours. He'd created a mobile crematorium disguised as a barbecue smoker that could process evidence anywhere on the property. But Tommy had also been mapping the property's burial sites and keeping mental notes about the family's patterns and vulnerabilities. He was planning an escape that would take him beyond the dog's tracking range and provide law enforcement with enough evidence to destroy the operation. His plan was discovered when Marcus noticed that several hand tools had been moved and sharpened without explanation. Tommy and Sarah were fed to the dogs on the same April morning. Their combined knowledge of the family's secrets had made them too dangerous to keep alive. Ezra learned from the experience that keeping prisoners, even useful ones, created complications that outweighed their benefits. The operation returned to its original simplicity: identify candidates, provide hospitality, dispose of guests. No exceptions. Reverend Jonathan Marsh had been building his congregation at Valdosta First Baptist for 15 years when his youngest son disappeared in June 1967. Daniel Marsh was 21 years old, fresh from seminary school, and full of ideas about social justice that made his father nervous. He'd been volunteering with civil rights organizations and asking uncomfortable questions about Christian duty in a changing South. The morning Daniel left home, he told his parents he was driving to Atlanta to meet with church leaders about starting a ministry for transient populations. Young people were flooding through Georgia on their way to cities and communes, and protests that respectable families didn't understand. Daniel believed the church had a responsibility to provide guidance and shelter for souls adrift in a confusing world. His car was found abandoned on Highway 41, 3 miles west of Valdosta. The engine was running, the driver's door was open, and Daniel's wallet lay on the front seat with money and identification intact. Sheriff Bradley organized search parties that combed the surrounding pine forests for days without finding any trace of the missing man. Reverend Marsh used his influence to keep the investigation active longer than usual. He contacted state authorities, hired private investigators, and offered increasingly large rewards for information about his son's disappearance. The case received newspaper coverage throughout South Georgia and attracted attention from civil rights organizations who suspected that Daniel had been targeted for his political activities. None of the investigators looked too closely at the Mercer property. The family had a reputation for helping travelers, not harming them. When Sheriff Bradley interviewed Ezra about potential witnesses, the conversation was friendly and brief. No, the family hadn't seen anyone matching Daniel's description. Yes, they'd keep watch for suspicious activity. They hoped the young man would be found safely. Ezra was telling the truth. The family hadn't seen anyone matching Daniel's description because by the time they encountered him, he was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound suffered when Marcus forced his car off the highway. Daniel never regained consciousness long enough to provide his name or explain his mission. He was simply another candidate who'd proven suitable for the family's particular brand of hospitality. His body fed the dogs for 3 days. The Mercers learned valuable lessons from Daniel Marsh's disappearance. High-profile cases attracted unwanted attention that could endanger the entire operation. Family members with influence and resources would pursue investigations longer than authorities preferred. Missing persons with political connections generated newspaper coverage that made everyone nervous. The family began screening candidates more carefully, avoiding anyone who might be missed immediately or extensively. College students during exam periods when their absence would be noticed. Travelers with scheduled arrivals who would trigger searches when they failed to appear. People whose disappearance might attract media attention or outside investigation. The operation grew more sophisticated as it grew more cautious. Marcus and Joel learned to research their targets before making contact, following potential candidates for hours or days to assess their connections and vulnerabilities. They developed cover stories that explained their presence in areas where hitchhikers gathered. They carried false identification and used stolen vehicles that couldn't be traced to the family property. The dogs grew larger and more numerous. 23 became 31 as Ezra expanded his breeding program to handle increased volume. The animals required more feeding space, more exercise areas, more complex management systems. Tommy Brewster's crematorium was expanded and improved by a succession of temporary prisoners who paid for their mechanical skills with extended lifespans. But success bred complacency, and complacency bred mistakes. The Mercers were about to encounter a candidate who would test their operational security in ways they hadn't anticipated. Margaret Powell carried a press card from the Atlanta Constitution and a professional skepticism that had served her well during 8 years of covering crime and corruption throughout the Southeast. In October 1968, she was investigating rumors about missing persons along Highway 41 for a series about safety issues facing the growing hitchhiker population. The story had originated with concerned parents who'd contacted the newspaper about children who'd disappeared while traveling through Georgia. College students who'd called home from Valdosta and never reached their destinations. Ex-servicemen who'd stopped for gas outside the city and vanished without explanation. young women who'd been seen at truck stops and diners, but never arrived at their intended destinations. Margaret's research had identified 17 cases over 7 years. All involved people traveling alone between the ages of 18 and 30. All had last been seen in the area around Valdosta. All had disappeared without leaving evidence of violence or robbery. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, but too scattered to suggest a single perpetrator. Local law enforcement insisted the disappearances reflected the hazards of hitchhiking rather than organized crime. Sheriff Bradley pointed out that thousands of people passed through his jurisdiction every year without incident. 17 missing persons over 7 years represented a statistically insignificant fraction of the total traffic. Most would eventually be found living new lives under different names in distant cities. Margaret wasn't convinced. Her experience covering crime had taught her to recognize patterns that officials preferred to ignore. Missing persons cases were expensive to investigate and difficult to solve. Departments measured success by closure rates, not by questions asked about cases without clear answers. The easiest way to maintain good statistics was avoiding complicated investigations that might drag on for months or years. She began conducting her own interviews with people who worked along Highway 41. Gas station attendants, diner waitresses, truck stop clerks, mechanic shop owners. People who saw the endless parade of travelers and might remember faces or conversations that seemed significant in retrospect. Luther Vance was helpful and concerned when Margaret visited his truck stop. He remembered several of the missing persons she described and expressed genuine worry about their safety. Young people were too trusting, he explained. They accepted rides from strangers and ignored obvious danger signs. He tried to warn travelers about the risks of hitchhiking, but few listened to advice from older people who'd lived long enough to develop proper caution. "I send the smart ones to the Mercers," Luther told Margaret. "Good Christian family about 7 miles west. They'll feed anyone who shows up hungry and make sure they get back on the road safely." Margaret noted the recommendation and decided to interview the Mercer family about their experiences with transient travelers. They might have encountered some of the missing persons during their travels or observed suspicious activity that could provide investigative leads. She drove to the Mercer property on October 15, 1968, following Luther's directions along increasingly remote roads that wound through pine forests and palmetto scrub. The family compound appeared suddenly after a quarter-mile of dirt road, a collection of rambling structures that seemed to have grown organically rather than according to any architectural plan. Dogs appeared before she'd turned off her engine. Dozens of German shepherds emerging from the underbrush and surrounding her rental car with professional interest. They didn't bark or threaten, just watched with the patient attention of creatures that understood their role in a larger system. Marcus Mercer approached the car carrying a wooden ladle that he used to strike a metal trough twice. The dogs immediately retreated to a respectful distance but remained visible among the trees and outbuildings. Margaret recognized a demonstration of control designed to establish the family's authority over their domain. "Help you with something?" Marcus asked. Margaret introduced herself and explained her investigation into missing persons along Highway 41. She was hoping to interview the family about their experiences with travelers who might have passed through the area. The Mercers had a reputation for helping people in need, and she wondered if they'd encountered any of the individuals on her list. Marcus invited her inside for coffee while he gathered the family to answer her questions. The main house was larger than it appeared from outside, with rooms added seemingly at random to accommodate an extended family structure that Margaret couldn't quite map. The interior smelled of wood smoke, cooking food, and something else she couldn't identify. Something organic and slightly sweet. Ezra emerged from a back room wearing coveralls and work boots still damp with red clay. He greeted Margaret politely, but kept their conversation in the front parlor, rather than inviting her deeper into the house. Beulah served coffee in mismatched cups and apologized for the simple accommodations. "We don't get many visitors from Atlanta," Beulah said, "especially not lady reporters." Margaret showed them photographs of the missing persons and described their last known locations. The family examined each image carefully, but claimed no memory of encountering any of the individuals. They agreed that Highway 41 carried dangerous traffic and expressed sympathy for the families searching for missing loved ones. "Terrible thing when young people disappear," Ezra said. "We've had a few stop here over the years, but they always moved on the next morning. Can't say what happened to them after they left our property." Margaret asked about their reputation for helping travelers and the network of referrals that directed people to their door. The family acknowledged that they occasionally provided meals and shelter for stranded motorists or hitchhikers who needed assistance. Christian charity, they explained. Their duty to help neighbors in need. The interview lasted 45 minutes and produced nothing that advanced Margaret's investigation. The Mercers were cooperative but unhelpful, expressing concern without providing useful information. They were either genuinely ignorant about the missing persons or skilled at concealing knowledge that might implicate them in something sinister. Margaret left the property with business cards and a promise to contact the family if her investigation uncovered information relevant to their area. She drove back to Valdosta with the feeling that she'd missed something important, but couldn't identify what. She never got the chance to figure it out. Margaret Powell checked into the Valdosta Motor Lodge on October 15, 1968, planning to spend several days interviewing local officials and business owners about the missing persons pattern she'd identified. Her room was on the ground floor, facing the parking lot, with easy access to her rental car and the highway that would carry her back to Atlanta when her research was complete. She called her editor at 6:30 that evening to report her progress and request an extension for the deadline on her article. The conversation was brief and professional. Margaret had developed several promising leads, but needed more time to verify information before submitting her story. She expected to return to Atlanta by the weekend, with enough material for a substantial investigative piece. At 8:15, she called her sister in Birmingham to confirm their plans for Thanksgiving dinner and discuss their mother's deteriorating health. The conversation lasted 23 minutes and covered family business that had nothing to do with Margaret's professional work. Her sister later told investigators that Margaret sounded tired but optimistic about her assignment. Those were the last phone calls Margaret Powell made from the Valdosta Motor Lodge. Her room was found empty the next morning, when housekeeping arrived to clean. The bed hadn't been slept in. Her luggage remained packed on the dresser. Her rental car was missing from the parking lot. Sheriff Bradley organized another search, but this time the investigation had a different character. Margaret Powell wasn't a transient hitchhiker whose disappearance could be explained by poor judgment or bad luck. She was a professional journalist with established patterns and reliable communication habits. Her failure to return phone calls or check out of her motel represented a clear break from normal behavior that suggested involuntary disappearance. The Atlanta Constitution offered a substantial reward for information about their missing reporter. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation assigned agents to assist local authorities with the case. Newspaper coverage spread across the Southeast, generating tips and theories from readers who'd followed Margaret's previous investigative work. None of the attention produced useful leads. Margaret's rental car was found 3 days later in a shopping center parking lot in Jacksonville, Florida. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints and showed no signs of violence or struggle. Investigators theorized that Margaret had encountered her abductor somewhere between the Valdosta Motor Lodge and an unknown destination where the car was abandoned. The timeline suggested she'd been taken during the evening hours when most travelers were settling into motels and restaurants for the night. Someone had intercepted her between appointments or while she was returning to her room. Someone who knew her location and schedule well enough to plan an efficient abduction. The Mercers were questioned again, more extensively this time. FBI agents interviewed each family member separately and searched the property with warrants that allowed them to examine outbuildings, vehicles, and areas where evidence might be concealed. They found nothing that connected the family to Margaret's disappearance or suggested involvement in any criminal activity. The agents noted the large number of dogs on the property and asked about the family's breeding program. Ezra explained that German Shepherds were valuable animals that provided security and income through selective sales to other breeders. The dogs were well fed and properly cared for according to professional standards. Their only unusual characteristic was their size and uniformly excellent health. "What do you feed them?" Agent Collins asked. "Meat scraps, dog food, whatever keeps them strong," Ezra replied. "Healthy dogs are happy dogs." The investigation produced a detailed profile of Margaret's last known activities, but no evidence of what happened to her after she left the Mercer property on October 15th. She'd interviewed several other people that afternoon and evening, including Luther Vance at his truck stop and Deputy Morrison at the county sheriff's office. All confirmed that she'd appeared normal and professional during their conversations. Margaret Powell's disappearance marked the end of external interest in the missing persons pattern along Highway 41. Her investigation died with her, and subsequent reporters who inquired about the story were told that it had been thoroughly examined by federal authorities without producing evidence of organized criminal activity. The missing persons were reclassified as individual cases rather than components of a larger pattern. The Mercers returned to their routine operations with enhanced security awareness. They'd learned that their activities could attract professional scrutiny from people with resources and expertise beyond local law enforcement. Future candidates would be screened more carefully to ensure they weren't connected to media organizations or investigative agencies. Margaret's press credentials and identification were burned with her personal effects. Her professional camera and recording equipment were dismantled and scattered across multiple disposal sites. Her notes about the Highway 41 disappearances were fed to the dogs along with other organic evidence. The story she'd been preparing to write was never published. Time changes everything, especially secrets. By 1970, the Mercer operation had grown too large for the family property and too complex for their original security measures. 9 years of systematic killing had left physical evidence scattered across 400 acres in patterns that careful investigation might reconstruct into an undeniable picture of organized murder. The dogs were the first problem. 47 German Shepherds required industrial quantities of food and produced waste that attracted attention from neighbors, game wardens, and county health inspectors. The animals had grown larger and more aggressive over the years, fed on high-protein diets that transformed them from working dogs into something closer to predators. They roamed the property in packs that made deliveries and service calls increasingly difficult to arrange. Ezra had hired Bobby Hutchins to manage the expanded kennel operation and handle interactions with outside authorities who asked questions about the family's breeding program. Bobby was a licensed veterinarian who'd lost his practice in Macon due to drinking problems and professional misconduct charges. He understood the value of steady employment that asked no questions about his methods or his past. Bobby's job was providing legitimate explanations for the dog's exceptional condition and the family's unusual feeding requirements. He filed breeding records with the American Kennel Club, maintained health certificates that satisfied county inspectors, and developed relationships with meat processing plants that supplied industrial quantities of animal protein at wholesale prices. What Bobby didn't know was the source of the supplemental protein that kept the Mercer dogs so remarkably healthy. He assumed the Achizi family was feeding them scraps from hunting expeditions or roadkill collected along Highway 41. Rural families often used creative approaches to reducing feed costs and disposing of organic waste. He asked no questions about deliveries that arrived after dark, or feeding schedules that seemed to follow patterns unrelated to normal canine nutrition. But Bobby was a trained veterinarian with expertise in animal behavior and nutrition. By 1971, he'd begun noticing characteristics in the Mercer dogs that suggested dietary influences beyond conventional feed sources. Their muscle development was exceptional. Their coat condition indicated protein intake higher than their documented food purchases could explain. Their aggressive behavior toward strangers suggested socialization patterns that didn't match their supposed breeding program. Most concerning was their response to human blood. Bobby had accidentally cut himself while treating an injured dog, and noticed that the animal's reaction to his bleeding was immediate and intense. They fixated on the scent in ways that reminded him of sharks responding to chum in the water. Their training appeared to include responses to stimuli that had nothing to do with security work or livestock protection. Bobby began keeping informal notes about his observations, initially as professional curiosity about an unusual breeding program. The Mercer dogs represented something unique in canine development, and Bobby thought their characteristics might have commercial value if properly documented and marketed. He started taking photographs and measurements that could support academic papers or breeding program promotion. His documentation was more thorough than he realized. The photographs captured background details that connected the dogs to the family's broader activities. Bone fragments in feeding areas that didn't match any known animal species. Tool marks on posts and buildings that suggested construction projects requiring unusual digging and waste disposal capabilities. Staining patterns on concrete surfaces that indicated regular cleaning of organic materials. Bobby's veterinary training also allowed him to recognize human bone fragments when he encountered them scattered around the dog feeding areas. His veterinary education had included courses in comparative anatomy that taught him to distinguish between species based on skeletal structure. The fragments he found around the Mercer property included phalanges, vertebrae, and cranial pieces that belonged to primates rather than livestock or game animals. Bobby confronted Ezra about his discoveries in March 1971, requesting an explanation for the human remains he'd documented throughout the property. The conversation took place in the family's root cellar, surrounded by shelves of preserved vegetables and meat that Ezra claimed came from hunting expeditions in the surrounding pine forests. "You're seeing things that aren't there," Ezra said. "Stress from your drinking problem. Maybe you should cut back on the medication you've been taking for your nerves." Bobby wasn't convinced. His photographs provided clear evidence of human bone fragments mixed with animal remains in areas where the dogs gathered for feeding. The concentration of material suggested systematic disposal rather than occasional hunting accidents. The condition of the bones indicated they'd been processed by animals trained to consume large quantities of organic matter efficiently. Ezra made Bobby an offer: double his current salary in exchange for destroying his documentation and forgetting what he thought he'd observed. The family valued Bobby's professional services and wanted to maintain their working relationship without complications that might require unpleasant solutions. Bobby accepted the offer, but kept copies of his most significant photographs hidden in a safety deposit box at Valdosta First National Bank. He continued working for the Mercers while developing an exit strategy that would allow him to leave Georgia with enough evidence to protect himself if the family decided he'd become a liability. His precautions proved insufficient. Bobby Hutchins disappeared on April 7, 1971, while driving to Valdosta for a routine banking appointment. His truck was found abandoned on Highway 41, with the engine running and his wallet undisturbed on the dashboard. Sheriff Bradley organized another search that produced no trace of the missing veterinarian. The Mercers told investigators that Bobby had been struggling with alcoholism and financial problems that made him unreliable as an employee. They'd been planning to terminate his services due to missed appointments and unprofessional behavior. His disappearance was unfortunate, but not surprising given his personal difficulties. What happened next would transform the Mercer operation from a local problem into a federal investigation. Valdosta First National Bank maintained strict policies about accessing safety deposit boxes belonging to missing persons. The bank's legal department required either death certificates or court orders before allowing anyone to examine contents that might be relevant to criminal investigations. Bobby Hutchins had been missing for 6 months when his estranged wife petitioned the court for permission to settle his affairs and claim his remaining assets. Janet Hutchins lived in Savannah and had divorced Bobby 2 years earlier due to his drinking and increasingly erratic behavior. She'd maintained minimal contact with her ex-husband, but remained listed as his emergency contact for legal and financial purposes. When Sheriff Bradley contacted her about Bobby's disappearance, she expressed concern but little surprise. Bobby was spiraling, Janet told investigators. He'd lost his practice, lost most of his friends, and was working for some family outside Valdosta that paid him cash under the table. I kept expecting something bad to happen. Janet's petition to access Bobby's safety deposit box was approved in October 1971. She drove to Valdosta with the court order and a locksmith provided by the bank's security department. The box contained documents related to Bobby's veterinary practice, personal letters, and a manila envelope marked insurance policy in Bobby's handwriting. Inside the envelope were 43 photographs documenting conditions at the Mercer property that no legitimate breeding operation would produce. Images of bone fragments scattered around dog feeding areas. Close-up shots of human skull pieces mixed with animal remains. Wide-angle views of burial sites marked with wooden stakes throughout the pine forests. Pictures of the dogs themselves, showing muscular development and aggressive behavior that suggested dietary supplements beyond conventional dog food. Janet recognized the implications immediately. Her ex-husband had documented evidence of systematic murder at the property where he'd been working when he disappeared. The photographs provided proof that the Mercer family was feeding human remains to their dogs and disposing of bodies throughout their land. Bobby had been killed to prevent him from exposing the operation. Janet delivered the photographs to Sheriff Bradley's office the same afternoon. She also provided investigators with Bobby's handwritten notes describing his observations about the dog's behavior and the family's feeding practices. The documentation was detailed enough to support search warrants and sophisticated enough to guide investigators toward evidence they might otherwise miss. Sheriff Bradley contacted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and requested assistance with what appeared to be a major criminal conspiracy involving multiple homicides. Federal agents arrived in Valdosta within 24 hours, bringing resources and expertise that local law enforcement couldn't match. The Mercer investigation officially began on October 23, 1971. The federal team included forensic anthropologists who specialized in identifying human remains, and crime scene analysts, who understood how to process large-scale burial sites. They brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and cadaver dogs trained to locate decomposed human remains, even when scattered across extensive areas. Initial reconnaissance of the Mercer property confirmed Bobby's documentation. The ground-penetrating radar identified dozens of anomalies, consistent with unmarked graves throughout the pine forests. Soil samples collected from areas around the dog-feeding sites tested positive for human DNA. Bone fragments collected from surfaces were confirmed to be human origin through laboratory analysis. The evidence was overwhelming but circumstantial, proving that the Mercer family had murdered specific individuals would require identifying victims and establishing timelines that connected their disappearances to documented deaths. The investigation needed witnesses who could testify about the family's methods and living victims who could describe what they'd observed at the property. Neither would be easy to find. The Mercers had been operating for over a decade with operational security that had prevented any previous exposure. They'd eliminated potential witnesses systematically and maintained plausible deniability about their activities. Breaking the case would require either confession or testimony from someone with inside knowledge of the family's operations. The investigators were about to discover that someone had been watching the Mercers much longer than Bobby Hutchins. Delbert Morrison was 78 years old and legally blind, but his hearing remained sharp enough to distinguish between natural forest sounds and human activity across the property line that separated his cabin from the Mercer compound. For 11 years, Delbert had been listening to machinery operating at unusual hours, dogs barking in coordinated patterns, and voices carrying conversations that didn't match the family's reputation for Christian hospitality. Delbert owned 40 acres of swampland adjacent to the Mercer property, inherited from his father, who'd homesteaded the area in 1897. The cabin where Delbert lived had been built without electricity or telephone service, making him invisible to census takers and tax assessors who preferred to pretend that people like Delbert didn't exist in 1970s Georgia. But Delbert noticed everything that happened within earshot of his property. The sounds of vehicles arriving at the Mercer place after midnight, the mechanical noise of digging equipment operating in areas where no legitimate construction should occur, the distinctive audio signature of large-scale burning that suggested materials other than household trash or agricultural waste. Most disturbing were the screams, brief outbursts of human distress that ended abruptly and were never followed by sounds of medical assistance or emergency response. Delbert had heard enough violence in his 78 years to recognize the difference between accidental injury and deliberate harm. The Mercer property produced sounds that reminded him of hog slaughtering operations, except the timing was wrong and the volume suggested larger animals. Delbert had never reported his observations to authorities because he'd learned through experience that law enforcement showed little interest in complaints from elderly black men who lived in shacks without modern conveniences. His word carried no weight against the testimony of prosperous white families with community connections and political influence. Reporting what he heard would accomplish nothing except making him a target for retaliation. But when federal agents began canvassing the area around the Mercer property, Delbert recognized an opportunity to provide information that might actually be taken seriously. The FBI had resources and authority that local sheriff's departments lacked. They were investigating crimes that transcended local politics and community relationships. Agent Patricia Woodruff interviewed Delbert at his cabin on November 2nd, 1971. She was a forensic specialist trained to extract reliable testimony from witnesses who might be marginalized or overlooked by conventional investigative approaches. Her experience working with elderly and disabled witnesses had taught her to recognize valuable information that other agents might dismiss. Delbert provided a detailed acoustic history of the Mercer operation spanning over a decade. He could identify specific dates when unusual activity had occurred because he marked time by radio programs, weather patterns, and seasonal changes that created reliable chronological anchors. His testimony correlated with missing person reports and established timelines that connected disappearances to documented activity at the family property. November 15th, 1968, Delbert told Agent Woodruff. That was the night they used the machinery for 3 hours straight. Digging sounds, then burning, then more digging. Happened 2 days after that lady reporter went missing. Same pattern I'd heard before when cars showed up and people stopped talking. Delbert's memory was extraordinary. He could recall specific incidents stretching back to 1961 and describe acoustic patterns that suggested the family's operational evolution over time. Early activities had been sporadic and disorganized. By the late 1960s, the Mercers were operating according to systematic procedures that indicated experience and planning. His testimony provided investigators with target dates for excavation and forensic analysis. Rather than searching randomly across 400 acres, they could focus on areas where unusual activity had been documented by a witness whose credibility increased with each verified detail. Delbert became the foundation witness whose observations guided the entire investigation. But the most shocking information Delbert provided wasn't about past crimes. It was about current activity that suggested the Mercer operation was still active even as federal agents prepared their case. As recently as October 29th, just 4 days before his interview, Delbert had heard familiar sounds from the property next door. Vehicles arriving after dark, machinery operating for several hours, the acoustic signature of systematic disposal activities that matched patterns he'd documented over 11 years of involuntary surveillance. The Mercers were still killing people while federal investigators built their case. Federal agents moved against the Mercer family on November 7, 1971, executing simultaneous search warrants at dawn while tactical units surrounded the property to prevent escapes or evidence destruction. The operation involved 43 agents and specialists equipped to process a complex crime scene that covered 400 acres and potentially contained dozens of murder victims. The family was awake and alert when the agents arrived, as if they'd been expecting official attention eventually. Ezra met the lead investigators at his front door wearing clean coveralls and work boots, presenting the image of a rural patriarch preparing for another day of honest labor. He examined the search warrants carefully before stepping aside to allow agents into his home. "We've got nothing to hide," Ezra told Agent Morrison. "Search whatever you need to search. We're law-abiding people who've been helping travelers for years. If someone told you different, they're lying for reasons I can't imagine." The family's initial cooperation was flawless. They provided keys to outbuildings, explained the layout of their property, and answered questions about their activities with consistent stories that matched their previous statements to local authorities. They were victims of misunderstanding by people who didn't appreciate their Christian charity toward strangers in need. But the dogs gave them away. 47 German shepherds scattered across the property showed behavioral patterns that contradicted everything the family claimed about their breeding program. The animals were aggressive toward strangers, territorial about specific areas, and possessive of objects that trained investigators immediately recognized as human bone fragments. Agent Collins was a specialist in canine behavior who'd worked with military and police dog programs throughout his career. He understood how different training methods produced specific behavioral characteristics in working animals. The Mercer dogs displayed responses that suggested systematic conditioning with human remains as training materials. These animals have been trained to consume human flesh, Collins reported to the command center. Their behavior around feeding areas indicates long-term exposure to human remains as a primary food source. They're not guard dogs or breeding stock. They're disposal tools. The forensic excavation began immediately. Ground-penetrating radar guided teams to burial sites scattered throughout the pine forests, each marked by surface indicators that matched Delbert Morrison's acoustic testimony about unusual nighttime activity. The investigators found evidence of systematic disposal spanning over a decade. The first excavation site yielded skeletal remains from at least 3 individuals buried in overlapping graves that had been disturbed and reused multiple times. Forensic analysis suggested the bodies had been processed to remove identifying characteristics before burial. Dental work had been extracted or destroyed. Fingerprints had been removed through chemical treatment. Personal effects had been stripped away to prevent identification. But the Mercers had been sloppy with some burials. The third excavation site contained remains that included a wedding ring engraved with initials and a date that matched one of the missing persons on Margaret Powell's original list. Physical evidence finally connected specific victims to the family property and established that the disappearances represented organized murder rather than random criminal activity. Ezra maintained his innocence even as agents uncovered increasingly damning evidence throughout his property. The bones were from hunting expeditions and livestock that had died of natural causes. The unusual burial sites reflected practical disposal of organic waste rather than murder victims. The dog's aggressive behavior resulted from protective instincts toward their territory rather than training with human remains. His denials became less credible as excavations revealed personal effects that belonged to confirmed missing persons. Margaret Powell's press credentials, Daniel Marsh's seminary identification, David Forrester's military discharge papers, Bobby Hutchins's veterinary license. Items that could only have reached the property through criminal activity that contradicted the family's claims about helping travelers. Marcus Mercer broke first. On November 10th, after 3 days of interrogation and mounting physical evidence, he confessed to participating in murders spanning over a decade. His testimony provided investigators with details about the family's operational methods and locations where additional evidence might be recovered. "We started with one," Marcus told investigators. "Just one man who was walking past our property. Father said it was an opportunity that wouldn't come again. But then another came, and another. It got easier each time until it wasn't even difficult anymore." Marcus's confession triggered additional admissions from other family members as their defense strategy collapsed under overwhelming evidence. Joel admitted to scouting Highway 41 for suitable candidates. Silas described the disposal methods used to eliminate evidence. Benjamin provided details about the dog training program that had consumed human remains for over a decade. Only Ezra refused to confess, maintaining his innocence even as his own sons testified about crimes they'd committed under his direction. He would take responsibility for poor judgment in trusting people who'd betrayed his family's hospitality, but he denied organizing or participating in systematic murder. The prosecution would have to prove their case against him in court, rather than relying on confession or cooperation. The final tally was staggering. Forensic teams identified remains from 37 confirmed victims buried across the Mercer property. Additional evidence suggested the actual total was higher, but decomposition and systematic disposal had eliminated proof beyond reasonable doubt. The Mercer family had operated one of the most prolific serial killing operations in American criminal history. The Mercer trials began in March 1972 with security measures unprecedented in Georgia legal history. The Valdosta courthouse was surrounded by federal marshals and state police officers as protesters from across the Southeast gathered to demand justice for victims whose names were still being identified through forensic analysis and missing person reports. Judge Harrison Fleming recused himself from the case due to potential conflicts of interest related to his previous handling of missing person investigations in the county. The replacement judge, Robert Hawkins from Atlanta, brought experience with complex criminal cases and no local connections that might compromise his objectivity. The prosecution team was led by federal attorneys who specialized in organized crime and serial murder cases. They faced the challenge of proving systematic conspiracy among family members while establishing individual responsibility for specific murders that had occurred over more than a decade. Physical evidence was extensive but largely circumstantial. The strongest testimony would come from family members who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Marcus Mercer testified for 6 days about the evolution of the family's operation from accidental killing to systematic murder. His detailed descriptions of operational methods and victim selection criteria provided prosecutors with evidence that the crimes represented organized conspiracy rather than random violence. Marcus implicated all adult family members in planning and executing murders that had claimed at least 37 lives. "Father taught us that some people wouldn't be missed," Marcus testified. "Drifters, runaways, people who'd already disappeared from their families. He said we were doing society a service by cleaning up human trash that nobody wanted anyway." Joel Mercer's testimony focused on the scouting and recruitment operations that had identified suitable victims along Highway 41. His confession detailed the network of contacts who'd referred travelers to the family property without understanding the consequences of their recommendations. Gas station attendants, truck stop owners, and law enforcement officers had unknowingly assisted the operation by directing vulnerable people toward the Mercer compound. "We looked for people who seemed lost," Joel testified. "Young folks with everything they owned in a backpack. Ex-soldiers who were drinking too much and talking about places they'd never reach. Girls running away from homes they couldn't go back to. People who wouldn't be reported missing for weeks or months." Silas Mercer described the disposal methods that had concealed evidence of systematic murder for over a decade. His testimony about the dog training program was particularly disturbing, revealing how the family had conditioned German shepherds to consume human remains as efficiently as commercial meat processing equipment. The animals had been bred and trained specifically to eliminate evidence of criminal activity. "The dogs were Father's idea," Silas testified. He said nature provided the perfect disposal system if you knew how to use it. "Dogs eat everything if they're hungry enough and trained proper. Bones, clothes, everything except metal and teeth. Even then, what was left was scattered across 400 acres where nobody would find it." Benjamin Mercer, the youngest adult family member, testified about the psychological conditioning that had made systematic murder seem normal within the family structure. He'd been 16 when the operation began and had learned to participate in killings as routine family business. His testimony revealed how isolated communities could develop moral frameworks that normalized extreme violence against outsiders. "It wasn't like we woke up one morning and decided to start killing people," Benjamin testified. "It happened gradual, one person at a time, until it seemed natural. Like slaughtering hogs or chickens. Just something that needed doing to keep the family fed and safe." The defense strategy focused on portraying the family members as victims of Ezra's domination, rather than willing participants in organized crime. Defense attorneys argued that Ezra had used psychological manipulation and threats of violence to coerce cooperation from his sons and extended family. The killings represented domestic abuse escalated to criminal conspiracy rather than independent decisions by responsible adults. But prosecution evidence revealed that family members had operated independently while following Ezra's general instructions, making autonomous decisions about victim selection and disposal methods. The operation's sophistication and longevity suggested planning and coordination that exceeded what coercion alone could produce. The family had functioned as an organized criminal enterprise with shared profits and distributed responsibilities. Beulah Mercer was charged separately and tried as an accessory to multiple murders. Her role had been providing domestic support for the operation while maintaining the family's reputation for hospitality toward travelers. She'd cooked meals for victims and maintained household routines that created normalcy during the final hours of their lives. Her defense attorney argued that Beulah had been intimidated into compliance by a husband who'd threatened her with violence if she refused to cooperate. But prosecution witnesses testified that Beulah had participated enthusiastically in planning sessions and had made suggestions about operational improvements that increased the family's efficiency at concealing evidence. The trials continued through summer 1972, with testimony from over 200 witnesses and evidence that filled 3 courtrooms with exhibits documenting the scope of the conspiracy. News coverage attracted national attention as details emerged about the longest-running serial murder operation in American criminal history. The verdicts were announced on September 12, 1972, after jury deliberations that lasted 4 days and covered charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to violation of federal laws governing interstate transportation of evidence. The complexity of the case required careful consideration of individual responsibility within a criminal organization that had operated as an extended family business. Ezra Mercer was convicted on 37 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by electrocution. The jury found that he had organized and directed the systematic killing of travelers while maintaining operational security that had concealed the crimes for over a decade. His refusal to cooperate with investigators or express remorse for his actions influenced the jury's recommendation for capital punishment. Marcus Mercer received life imprisonment without possibility of parole in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors and testimony against other family members. The court recognized his assistance in solving the case, while acknowledging that his participation in multiple murders made him ineligible for lesser sentences. He was transferred to federal prison in Atlanta, where he remained in protective custody due to threats from other inmates. Joel, Silas, and Benjamin Mercer each received sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment, depending on their level of participation and cooperation with authorities. The court considered their youth when the operation began while holding them responsible for adult decisions to continue participating in organized murder. None would be eligible for parole before 1997. Beulah Mercer was sentenced to 15 years for accessory to murder and conspiracy charges. Her defense attorney's argument about domestic intimidation influenced the court's decision to impose a sentence below prosecution recommendations. She was released in 1984 and died in a nursing home in Macon 3 years later, without providing additional information about the family's activities. The extended family members and associates who'd assisted the operation received varying sentences based on their knowledge and participation levels. Luther Vance was convicted of conspiracy charges for referring travelers to the Mercer property while knowing they might not leave alive. His truck stop was closed permanently and the property sold to satisfy victim restitution requirements. Dr. Kowalski lost his medical license and faced criminal charges for failing to properly investigate suspicious remains that could have exposed the operation years earlier. His willingness to avoid difficult questions had enabled the family to continue killing while maintaining operational security. He died while awaiting trial, reportedly from natural causes, though some investigators suspected suicide. Judge Fleming was censured by the State Judicial Commission for his handling of missing person cases that might have revealed the criminal conspiracy earlier. His pattern of avoiding complex investigations had created opportunities for the Mercers to operate without official scrutiny. He resigned from the bench rather than face additional disciplinary proceedings. The property was seized under federal forfeiture laws and converted into a memorial for the 37 identified victims. A stone monument lists their names alongside an inscription acknowledging the unknown number of additional people who died on the site. The memorial is maintained by volunteer groups representing families of missing persons whose cases were never solved. The dogs were euthanized despite protests from animal rights organizations who argued that the animals were victims of criminal training rather than willing participants in murder. Forensic veterinarians determined that 11 years of systematic conditioning with human remains had created behavioral patterns that couldn't be reversed through retraining. The animals represented a public safety threat that required permanent elimination. Ezra Mercer was executed on January 15, 1975, after exhausting all appeals and refusing final requests for information about additional victims. He maintained his innocence until the end, claiming that his family had been persecuted for helping travelers who'd met unfortunate accidents on their property. His execution was witnessed by representatives from victim families and law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation. The case influenced federal legislation requiring improved coordination between local authorities and federal agencies when investigating missing person patterns that might indicate organized crime. The Mercer investigation revealed gaps in information sharing that had allowed the operation to continue undetected, while generating reports that were filed separately without revealing connections between disappearances. Training programs for law enforcement officers now include modules on recognizing patterns in missing person cases that might indicate systematic criminal activity rather than individual incidents. The Mercer case serves as a textbook example of how serial killing operations can exploit jurisdictional boundaries and investigative limitations to avoid detection. Highway 41 still carries traffic between Georgia's interior and its coastal plains, though Interstate 75 now handles most commercial transportation through the region. The old road serves local communities and travelers who prefer scenic routes through pine forests and small towns that preserve echoes of an earlier South. The Mercer property remains visible from the highway, marked by a historical sign that provides basic information about the crimes that occurred there between 1961 and 1971. The memorial stone attracts visitors who want to pay respects to identified victims while acknowledging the unknown number of people who died without ever being found. Investigators continue receiving reports about potential additional victims whose disappearances might be connected to the Mercer operation. Cold case detectives periodically review missing person files from the 1960s and early 70s, looking for patterns that might reveal connections to the family's activities. Advanced forensic techniques have identified 3 additional victims from remains that were previously too degraded for positive identification. Delbert Morrison lived until 1986, remaining in his cabin on the property adjacent to the former Mercer compound. He never granted media interviews about his role in exposing the operation, preferring to avoid attention that might attract unwanted visitors or curiosity seekers. His testimony remained sealed under federal witness protection protocols, until his death released the records for historical research. Local residents rarely discuss the Mercer case openly, treating it as a shameful chapter in community history that reflects poorly on everyone who lived in the area during the operation's active years. The conspiracy required cooperation from people who chose not to investigate obvious inconsistencies in the family's activities. Questions about complicity and responsibility extend beyond the immediate family to include neighbors, officials, and business associates who enabled the crimes through willful ignorance. The case influences contemporary discussions about missing person investigations and the social factors that make certain populations vulnerable to predatory crime. Hitchhikers, runaways, migrant workers, and other transient groups remain at higher risk for victimization because their disappearances generate less immediate attention from authorities and communities. The Mercer operation succeeded partly because it targeted people whose lives were already marginal and whose absence wouldn't be noticed quickly. Academic researchers study the case as an example of how geographic isolation and community insularity can enable systematic criminal activity to continue undetected for extended periods. Rural areas with limited law enforcement resources and strong traditions of family privacy create environments where organized crime can flourish if properly concealed. The Mercers understood these dynamics and exploited them effectively until external investigation finally exposed their activities. Some investigators believe the operation may have extended beyond the confirmed 37 victims, possibly including crimes that occurred before 1961 or after the family began limiting their activities in response to increased scrutiny. The full scope of the conspiracy may never be known, as evidence was systematically destroyed and potential witnesses eliminated or intimidated into silence. The Mercer dogs were exceptionally well fed for a reason that nobody wants to remember, but nobody can forget. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.